Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, Jolene, for the introduction. I'm happy to be here. I will just kind of preface that I'm not going to be talking a lot about engineering, so it's okay. It won't be super boring. But I will give a little plug for the research at the end. But I wanted to just kind of first start by making sure that I take the time to introduce myself and my ke, or my kin. And I'll do this first just by opening up in my own native tongue. And since we'll be speaking about Indigenous peoples and climate and our knowledge systems, I think it's very important to give time to our languages, which are the root of our knowledge. So yat shikedo shidine Michael Charles Yaneshe, bilagana nishle shihibashichin, bilagana dashishche, ado nakai dine additionally, akot ego dine hasti nishle, kinlachi denisha. So to me, what makes us Indigenous peoples is our pursuit of understanding how we all relate to each other and the other lives and spirits around us. So to honor that, I just introduced myself and my relations, or the clans that make me Diné, or Navajo. And those clans are Ashihi, or Salt people, and Nakai Diné, or Mexican Navajo. And I also introduced where my family comes from, which is Kinlachi, Arizona. That's where the photos on the left and the middle were taken. And just like Ke is our kinship in our family, Keya is our relationship between our feet and the ground below us. And so we come from the beautiful Dineta, or Diné Bekeya, which is the Navajo Nation. And that's where most relate kind of this whole region to what I would just, usually this image on the right, or Monument Valley. And this image is likely familiar to people who haven't visited the area due to like an early 2000s Windows screensaver or a John Wayne movie. And although I'm a scientist and engineer, my journey has largely been driven by simply just trying to be a good relative to my people. And I do have to say that I thank the American Indian Indigenous Studies program and Aguego, the house, to thank you for instilling that into me, the importance of that community. Even when I was 18 years old, living across the country away from my family. And so I chose to study chemical engineering from day one, mostly just looking for something challenging after moving here from a small school with a graduating class of 18. And as you can imagine, there wasn't a lot of advanced classes offered. And I ended up sticking with chemical engineering through my PhD work before working as a postdoc in comparative studies, mostly working with historians on indigenous dispossession and its relationship to land-grant universities, like the one that we're sitting on today. And so along the way, I was studying sustainable design and kind of got pulled into the environmental movement, largely due to the events that occurred at Standing Rock. While attending marches and rallies, I experienced an erasure of the indigenous experience of what was happening. And so we had these people protesting all over the country, but specifically where I was at Ohio State in the Midwest, there was all these protesters that were just speaking about the evil of oil and the need for renewable energy, but not really about the evil of attacking people with hired mercenaries, with attack dogs and water cannons in sub-zero temperature. They weren't really talking about the need for restoring humanity to those protecting their lands or the recognition of indigenous sovereignty. And it became a huge greenwashing of the events at Standing Rock that really directed me towards working with environmental NGOs to raise indigenous voices and make sure that this invisibility was addressed. So that took me on a whole other journey doing community work alongside with my research. So I've worked with a lot of youth-led organizations, training young people to tell their stories and bring their energy into social movements. I became engaged with the UN climate negotiations and have been attending them for about the past 6 years. I've done a lot of work from organizing those large-scale demonstrations that you kind of see in the media and the ones that make the front page of the New York Times. And also leading a team of Indigenous youth that really just focused on bringing spirit and ceremony to exhausting policy conferences. And so throughout this kind of whole journey, I began to learn what policy battles existed, how to kind of work with our tribal leaders, our elders, and our policy strategists to make sure that our cultural voices and stories from home are engaging these political aspects as much as possible. And kind of diving back into the community work through these environmental NGOs and through all this climate organizing, I think really opened up lots of doors to kind of help support relatives organizing around pretty much anything that seems to come up, whether it's high school education, community prayer runs, COVID relief, missing and murdered Indigenous women. And most importantly, I feel like a lot of this community work is what continues to make sure that the research that we do is meaningfully connected to Indigenous communities and kind of grounded in our cultural values and wisdom. So thanks for bearing with me, but I wanted to give that introduction of who I am and where I come from. And so before we talk about climate action, I just want to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page and have a broad understanding of the issue at hand. When we talk about climate change, we're talking about the long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns due to the increase in greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. We connect this steep increase in emissions to human and industrial activity, which is why the metrics that we use when referring to warming or the concentration of carbon is relative to what we call pre-industrial levels. So typically this is tied to the Industrial Revolution, so we compare our measurements as best as we can back to patterns from the mid to late 1800s. One of the most important things that I think we need to agree upon is that the impacts of climate change do exist today, and that these impacts are not and will not be experienced uniformly. These impacts will look different in every ecosystem, and so looking at kind of this cartoon figure up here, I think it has just a good example of some of these different climate impacts that will be experienced in different ecosystems. So we know that higher temperatures means more heat waves, which poses dangers to those already living in the planet's hottest climates. We know that higher temperatures means less snow and ice, less higher elevation glaciers that feed our river systems, and less permafrost and habitat for those who live in the Arctic. And we must not forget that everything is related. The lost permafrost in the Arctic is the same water that will rise the sea levels, threatening the landscapes of coastal communities. Higher temperatures means warmer oceans and higher ocean acidification, and this damages coral reefs and aquatic ecosystems, which form the foundational diets for many communities who live in the coastal regions. And just like the aquatic ecosystems, the migration patterns of animals on land will also be increasingly uncertain, as they also adapt to these changes in their habitats and environments. This warming also leads to more uncertainty in participation patterns, more frequent storms with higher intensity in some regions, while also increasing drought and wildfire in others. And every community from every ecosystem will need to learn how to adjust to these changes, while also preparing for emergencies and realistically expecting tragedies. When it comes to climate, we must understand that some communities are more vulnerable than others, and the way that we act and respond to climate must also reflect this understanding of vulnerability. And so kind of the next question I'm going to ask is, what makes a community vulnerable? And so the following points that I'm going to kind of put up here are meant to be general, but I will also just kind of keep tying these consistently to Indigenous peoples issues as we kind of go through them. So first and foremost, those who live closest to the land and those who will experience those who will experience the highest intensity of climate impacts. It's those communities like Indigenous peoples whose livelihoods, cultural practices, and economies are directly dependent on understanding and predicting natural processes and systems. So this includes knowing the land and the local ecosystems to produce food, knowing the migration patterns of animals for hunting, depending on the availability of clean water in their landscapes without large-scale wastewater infrastructures, and having fuel and fibers available for heat, cooking, and shelter. There's a study that has shown that your GDPs and ecological literacy are negatively correlated. So it means that as people experience more wealth, their ability to identify the plants around them decreases. So this shows that there's just this increasing disconnect that our society has with the natural world around us, forgetting the value that we have as Indigenous peoples in striving to understand how we relate to everything around us, five-fingered beings and non-five-fingered beings. The other aspects of vulnerability include direct risk of losing homelands due to the melting permafrost, rising sea levels, or increase in floodplain area. For Indigenous peoples, this can include losing sacred sites, burial grounds, and the exact lands that gifted language, life, and teachings to the communities who hold this risk. Identities and knowledge systems play a huge role in who we are as Indigenous peoples, and even those communities who may not be at risk of losing ground area will still experience changes to the landscape that their cultures and communities were built on. This means that practices, stories, and teachings that have been passed down for generation to generation may no longer accurately describe the relationships that they see around them. This threatens the way that we connect to our ancestors, our teachings, and even to ourselves. When climate emergencies occur, a lack of infrastructure in communities make them vulnerable because resources and aid from outside the community may not have clear avenues for mobilization and distribution. This directly ties to poverty, where funding to build this infrastructure may not exist, to both adapt to the changes and prepare for natural disasters, while also having a surplus to recover and repair that which is lost and damaged. Finally, the funding is also needed for new solutions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and address the root cause of climate changes. It's also kind of known as mitigation, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a few slides. And I think kind of the last two vulnerabilities that I've listed here, I think are ones that are often left out of climate action discussions. And that's the vulnerability that communities will experience because they occupy land that has been stewarded without urbanization and rapid development. As the world is pursuing these solutions to the climate crisis, the role of land in ecological solutions is gaining attention as an opportunity through nature-based solutions and market-based offsets. And this also means that those in power with governmental authority or just money may target undeveloped land that is thriving ecologically, just like the land occupied by many indigenous people across the globe. So this becomes a much greater threat in a world if we do not uphold, recognize, and honor both human rights and indigenous rights. And the difference between the two is that the human rights recognize individual rights such as the right to life, liberty, and security, but indigenous rights are held collectively, such as the right to self-determination, self-government, the right to a nationality, and the right to not be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of culture. And within both of these, they're outlined by texts such as the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we're going to kind of also pull out this question of what makes a community vulnerable through a case study. We're going to look at kind of COVID, actually, back home on my nation, on Navajo Nation. And I like to use this case study because I think it will show vulnerability in just a different lens that's tangible to all of us because of how COVID impacted us and challenged every single one of ours normal, per se. But also because I think we can use this study to transition the talk from vulnerability also to response and action. And so we'll have kind of more concrete examples using something like this that's so current. So if you're not familiar with the Navajo Nation, let's just look at some numbers first. It sits right around the Four Corners area in the southwest. So we have the Navajo Nation, the Hopi Reservation, which is also within the Navajo. And then you see that it actually crosses 3 states, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. And it's also just one of it's the largest reservation in the US. There's about 173,000 people living on the reservation according to the last census. And it's by land area, we always just use the metric that it's approximately the same land area as West Virginia. It's the one I've always heard growing up and continue to hear. But I think it's also notable it's bigger than 10 states as we look through these numbers. And on the reservation, about 30% of homes do not have electricity, and 40% are without running water. 70% are unemployed, and we sit on an estimated 5 to 10% of energy resources in the US. And all of these numbers are pretty debatable, and we see kind of large ranges around within the reservation just because of how we collect data and who gets included in these, and how we traditionally even just can kind of stay in contact and track people that may or may not have electricity, addresses, the kind of normal infrastructures in which we collect data throughout the rest of the country. But because of our resources, Navajo Nation also has undergone many industrialization projects, primarily coal and uranium mining. Industrialization was used as a tool against our people with the promise of economic development, improved livelihoods, but instead we have high rates of diabetes based on our commodity food program diets, cancer proved to be tied to the uranium extraction, and lung disease from these large coal-fired power plants. We really became sacrifice zones because these industries were not really wanted near urban areas due to known health impacts. Poverty was a vulnerable state that was used to push industrialization on our lands without our communities really seeing the economic benefits, which we see in some of those first metrics. And so what's this result? Well, we have over 500 abandoned uranium mine sites with radioactivity levels that are 10 to 25 times above what's considered safe. This not only plays an impact on those who live close to the mine sites, but also plays a huge role in our water supply. Gathering water is a huge part of many families' daily lives and daily experiences, but the legacy of uranium mining has just left poisoned groundwater, making many family wells unsafe to drink from. And kind of even worse, without regulated water systems, or with unregulated water systems, some of the families don't even know if their water is safe to drink or not. And kind of one of the last things that is important to also understand when we talk about, as we're going to talk about the impacts of COVID, is across the entire reservation, which is again bigger than 10 states, there are only about 13 grocery stores, meaning that most families travel very long distances for food, or they rely on their own food production or that of a neighbor's. It also means that diets are typically foods that can be stored for a very long time. And so I just wanted to share some of these metrics because I think it kind of ties directly to those examples we had of vulnerable communities on the last slide. But I think, again, we're going to talk about it in how it plays out amidst a global pandemic. So in May 18th in 2020, the CNN headline read that the Navajo Nation surpasses New York State for the highest COVID-19 infection rate in the US. And so one thing I like to think about with this is let's just kind of as a group think about all the responses that we had as a country when COVID hit. What did we do? So we quarantined, we had lockdowns, we emphasized the importance of hand washing, we required masks, gloves, PPE. But when a community relies on each other for survival and daily necessities, a quarantine disrupts everything. There was no Uber Eats or grocery delivery. They had to meet at the community well and water sources just to gather water to survive. Younger bodies still had to help elders to make sure that they were able to carry their water and have firewood for their homes. And when it comes to hand washing, this becomes a luxury when you're hauling your own water. Even washing dishes may become a difficult task. So with only a handful of stores, how were people expected to get the masks, the gloves, the PPE that were really the solutions that we stress so heavily nationwide? So not only was the community vulnerable to the impacts of COVID, but also to the response and the actions that were being practiced around the world. This is kind of a foreshadowing to what we're going to talk about with climate. But again, I think this is the transition where we get to talk about how did we respond? Well, there were many different groups of people organizing to support the community. We had grassroots organizers. One example I always use is this $8 million GoFundMe that was put together, and through that they not only just gathered resources but put together an entire local distribution network for incoming supplies and delivery. They had trucks going out to homes in some of the most rural areas to make sure that the elders were aware of the resources and they could sign up for regular deliveries. They had local chapter organizers, which is similar to kind of like a county in other parts of the US. But they had local chapter organizers and volunteers who monitored an online sign-up sheet. And in many cases, it was actually students that were living off the reservation who would sign up their family back home to receive the goods. Our people were taking care of each other using the many skills and talents that we have to fundraise, to shop, to load trucks, to deliver, and even inform families about the virus. We also had additional stimulus checks distributed by our Navajo Nation tribal government. And these checks played an important role because if you think about 70% of people are unemployed, that means many don't file taxes, 30% don't have electricity, and we're in a lockdown. So there's not really another way to access the internet, which was, I believe, the only way that I really saw of how to fill out the federal forms. So the Navajo Nation stimulus was just a little bit more accessible in the sense that it required a paper mail-in form, your tribal enrollment information, and just a few sentences describing your need and the size of your family. And lastly, there were also the big federal dollars that were moved towards the Navajo Nation through the American Recovery Rescue Plan Act. About $2 billion were offered to Navajo Nation for building infrastructure. And so kind of my point by bringing this all up is that each of these responses played a completely different role. We can kind of ask which actions met the immediate needs of the community members. And I think the most kind of obvious answer to me is the role of the grassroots organizing. It was neighbors helping neighbors, arguably probably met the most immediate needs of the community members. It's what directly brought food, water, sanitation equipment, and PPE to the doorsteps of community members. And I didn't mention this, but also a lot of our, on the slides anywhere, but a lot of other big kind of like celebrities that put together these big donations and brought, you know, these big like haul trucks and water and all these different things. They actually relied on these networks that were already existing by just neighborhoods that put them together. And so then again, which may better protect and prepare the community in the future? Well, $2 billion in infrastructure development could play a pretty big role in preparing for future pandemics, emergencies, or natural disasters. The multiple approaches between grassroots organizing, federal policy, and budgeting, and simply being a good neighbor were important to balance as we aimed to quickly react, as well as help families recover and prepare for the future. So I hope we're starting to see some parallels to climate responses, because that's where we're gonna move next to. Actually, just kidding, I put in this slide. So I wanna go back to the original question of the talk, which is, are we victims or are we solutions? So I wanted to just look at some direct quotes from the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So the first is, Indigenous peoples are among the first to face the direct consequences of climate change due to their dependence upon and close relationship with the environment and its resources. Climate change exacerbates the difficulties already faced by Indigenous communities, including political and economic marginalization, loss of land and resources, human rights violations, discrimination, and unemployment. And then have a second one, followed by, climate change poses threats and dangers to the survival of Indigenous communities worldwide, even though Indigenous peoples contribute the least to greenhouse gas emissions. So, are we victims? In many ways, yes. We're suffering from a problem that we did not create. However, our identities are much bigger than simply playing victim. Just like we responded to the pandemic, we have solutions. We have strong communities, we are smart people, we can organize, and most importantly, we carry the strongest relationships with our Mother Earth or with our Kea. So we also know that climate change and climate action is a complex global issue. The question that may be the most relevant is, what role do we play and what role can we play? So I'm going to go back to looking at climate action from a broad lens, one that isn't necessarily specific to Indigenous peoples. And I just kind of want to bring it back to kind of the work that we're doing internationally in terms of what are our options? What do we do to respond to climate? So kind of the frameworks that we've kind of developed within international policy is these three words, which is mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damages, if you consider that one word. But mitigation being simply, how do we prevent the emissions? How do we stop climate change at the root? How do we adjust the activities that we have so that we are emitting less greenhouse gas? Adaptation is knowing that we're not going to stop climate change completely. How do we prepare our communities to adapt to these changes that we know are coming or that we can predict are coming in the future? And then finally, loss and damages are, how do we respond to when things do happen, catastrophes happen, emergencies happen? Are we prepared to recover from what is lost and damaged? So a lot of the conversations around the needs go to, I mean, first and foremost is funding. If you've ever worked with anything in policy, that's always the number one thing is where's the money coming from? The second is technological shifts. This is new technologies, renewable technologies, mostly associated with mitigation, but in some cases, how can technology also help us adapt? Behavioral shifts, how we act every single day as a society, how we make these big cultural shifts, how do we reconnect with the land? All those would be under behavioral shifts. International cooperation, how do we just have this conversation to agree on things and move forward on these large-scale issues together? And kind of the last one that I always throw in is actions that avoid unintended consequences. So as we talk about all these climate actions, how do we make sure that whatever we decide to do as a globe or as a society, how do we make sure these solutions are robust to those most vulnerable? So I'm going to kind of pivot it back to now acting on climate as Indigenous peoples. what are our options? And I'm just going to kind of highlight 3 different ways that I've seen and I've experienced the engagement. So the first is directly engaging in policy. We have a number of Indigenous peoples who come from all over the world. We find ways to self-organize our own policies and strategies, trying to uplift the needs of different regions. But you will see, Indigenous people showing up to these. This is kind of just a forum, a dialogue from different states. This is the US right here and the rest of them that are not in the photo. But we're advocating as Indigenous peoples, both to our parties, both directly to United Nations at an international level. And then I think that policy engagement also will trickle down all the way to local elections or county level organizing. We can create visibility. This is through direct actions, through the way that we tell stories on social media, the way we publish in mainstream media. The more and more that we can create visibility about the issues that we have is always going to end up helping not only our own people see themselves in as part of these solutions, but also open up the eyes of non-Indigenous communities around the world to what we have, the power we have, the relationships that we have as solutions to kind of keep moving forward. And then I think the third one is just continuing to practice our cultures. I think one of the biggest things I always advocate for, especially with young people, is the biggest thing you can do to impact climate is go back and learn your culture, learn your languages, learn your practices, because we have these answers. And the more and more we have strong cultural leaders, the better off we will be to share that knowledge outside of our communities if we choose to do so. So this was just the opening. This is Chief Ninawa from Brazil in the Amazon. And so they did a great chant. Well, my favorite part actually about this event was it was an hour-long event, and they asked me to kind of organize an opening that would be led by Indigenous peoples. And of course, they didn't ask me how long it would take or how it was going to impact the agenda. And we took up a third just by the opening, because we, and that was my favorite part. I was like, I don't know, it's going to take how long as it takes. But again, what are our needs? When we actually show up to these places, what are we fighting for? I think the biggest things that I've seen in terms of over just policy from Indigenous peoples globally, that I think these are the main ones that I keep repeating and seeing over and over about how do we get these things into the text. And the first is direct access to funding. Noting that when we were talking about COVID, we have these giant grants, $2 billion going to the tribal government, but how does that trickle down to the elder who's off in their house by themselves up on a mountain? The direct access and building out these platforms for even distributing funding is so important to Indigenous peoples, so we don't get forgotten in the way that we start trickling these big dollars and resources out. Second is direct platforms for effective participation. How do we build out places where we actually can bring the stories we have, bring the prophecies that we have? How do we find ways to engage that meaningfully, so it's not just a meeting where we meet with the states and then they say, all right, we did that, now we can kind of check that box. And so that's something I've seen develop and improve over the years even within kind of the US now, when we show up, we have kind of an ongoing meeting and dialogue between Indigenous peoples and usually White House climate representatives. It's been John Kerry the last 2 years. So just kind of building out what it means to actually have these engagements between cultural leaders, tribal leaders, policy strategists that are all from Indigenous communities. Recognition of Indigenous rights is huge in climate actions. We talked about the vulnerability we have in maintaining valuable resources when we commodify land. So how do we make sure that we protect our people, to make sure that our lands aren't taken, to make sure that our sovereignty and our ability to be in charge of what happens on our land is recognized. That goes directly in hand with free, prior, and informed consent on all projects on our lands. And then also protection. This also kind of goes within the same grouping, but protection from political and industrial powers who see land as a commodity. And then back to revitalization of our languages and practices, where I cannot emphasize enough is one of the best things that we can do as Indigenous peoples. And so I wanted to just kind of re-emphasize that Indigenous peoples are solutions. Revitalization of our cultures, our languages, and our practices are important because we carry the solutions as we carry our medicines. So I just wanted to give a few more numbers to consider. Traditional indigenous territories encompass up to 22% of the world's land surface, as they coincide with areas that hold 80% of the planet's biodiversity. Followed by indigenous and community lands are a globally important carbon sink, holding at least 22% of the carbon stored in tropical and subtropical forests, and at least 17% of the total carbon, including soil carbon stored in forests. So I think this just kind of, again, emphasizes the fact that the more and more we are able to do what we already are doing, the better off that we'll be, not just as indigenous peoples, but as a planet, and to meet those global goals that we're setting. However, here's the downside. Our land has and always have been under attack since first contact, and continue to be under attack today. So I found just a few examples from within the last 6 years, just showing how, even though we kind of are starting to recognize this, we're still seeing these violations of indigenous sovereignty in the way that we manage lands. So if you're not familiar with these three, I'll just give a very brief overview. But the first being Standing Rock. If you're not familiar, we can actually just talk about how all of these played out later if we want to in our dialogue, but I'll just kind of give the quick overview. But Standing Rock being the fight over the Dakota Access Pipeline, which has kind of gone up and down. We had Mauna Kea, where they were fighting the 30-meter telescope, which was also funded in part by Cornell, just to throw that out there. And that being on Mauna Kea, one of their most sacred mountains, to the Kingdom of Hawaii. And then we have, I'm going to mispronounce it, so I just kind of am not going to try. But this is a community in New Zealand, where they basically were fighting housing development over one of their sacred burial grounds. We can talk more about these outcomes if we want, as I said, but I think one thing that's important to remember, that even these that have been won, where the projects haven't moved forward, or the people that stood up to protect the land have actually succeeded in what they came out to do, there was still a ton of criminalization of these protests, people that are still in jail today for these. They have permanent injuries or have passed due to their role in fighting. So when it comes back to this idea of human rights and indigenous rights, even when we're out there on the front line protecting things, we're still living with the consequences, even if we end up, quote unquote, winning. So again, bringing it back to victims or solutions. Our inseparability from the land is what makes us both vulnerable and most positioned to listen, learn, and teach from her. I think we're in the best position to be both victims and solutions. We have the most at stake. We have the most to offer when it comes to reconnecting to the land in our spirit. Yet we need cooperation, resources, and protection to scale up the work of our communities. So the real questions lie: is the rest of the world willing to receive our teachings without exploitation? Are colonizing governments willing to relinquish power and control to empower indigenous communities to flourish and lead? As a society, are we willing to acknowledge the harms of the past, to heal together and move forward? I think it's very important that we must remember how the process of colonization has broken the trust of those they've tried to colonize, and have left a legacy of broken promises, stolen children, murdered women and children, and little advocacy of our rights to even exist. So to move forward, we need to heal together before we can really work together. And lastly, this is a bit my take, but the cheapest and most effective climate action is honoring the sovereignty of indigenous peoples and ensuring we have the resources to protect our communities. And if people choose to listen to us, that's just a bonus. So, is there hope? Like we saw in the COVID-19 case, hope comes from the community organizing. It comes from the on-the-ground efforts. It comes from neighbors looking after each other, from the small-scale projects that we do together, from recognizing the humanity of others. There needs to be a balance between how we aim to address climate, between large-scale marches to small-scale actions in your own home or within your community, to long-term political battles, to move millions and billions of dollars, to communities who need it most, to just simple gatherings that bring people together and bring their spirits together to just bring joy into the world. I think without hope, we are lost. So we must look into the beautiful aspects of humanity and those we love to find hope and keep fighting. I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping up because I think we can get to the food sooner. But this is one of the prophecies that I always love sharing when I talk about the role of Indigenous peoples, but also the question about hope. And this is from Crazy Horse, who's a Oglala Lakota, and it reads, "Upon suffering beyond suffering, the Red Nation shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing for a sick world, a world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separations, a world longing for light again. I see a time of 7 generations when all the colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole earth will become one circle again." So we have prophecies that do lead towards hope. And as I mentioned, I'm going to give a very quick plug about how this ties a little bit to my research on the engineering side. So I just wanted to just make sure that I give 2 minutes about this to kind of a little plug of what I do over in the biological and environmental engineering department. It's a very simple cartoon, but essentially what we work on is computational sustainable design, where we focus not only on technological systems, but also ecological systems. We build out models and mathematical frameworks for how to include spatial and temporal dynamics of ecosystem services and how they interact with technological systems and impact community sustainability. And then along with the computational work, I'm also working on building out relationships, mostly with tribal communities, to work on specific case studies where we bring in grant money from our computational research and work to build out practical projects that are determined by the community so that we can kind of test our models and compare if our information is useful, both compared in collaboration with the local, the knowledge of the local Indigenous community and its leaders. So that was just my short plug in case this wanted to creep into the follow-up conversations at all, whether it's about research or the community engagement portion. So with that, I just want to say yeah or thank you.